Rufus had always walked through life like a man convinced the ground would rearrange itself beneath his feet before daring to trip him. He carried arrogance the way some men carried wallets, always within reach, always flaunted, and never questioned. Tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed even on lazy days, Rufus enjoyed the sound of his own confidence. His laughter was loud, his opinions louder, and his certainty absolute. He believed consequences were stories meant for other people, men less clever, less charming, less important than he was. When Rufus spoke, he expected agreement. When he made mistakes, he expected forgiveness without apology. And when he loved or claimed to, he believed his presence alone was enough to sustain devotion. Marriage, to Rufus, was proof of victory rather than partnership. Betty had been won, not chosen daily. He liked to remind himself, and sometimes her, that she was fortunate to have him. In his mind, Betty's calm nature wasn't strength, it was compliance. Her patience wasn't wisdom, it was dependence. Rufus liked admiration the way some men liked air, and when admiration grew quiet, he sought it elsewhere without guilt. The world, especially the digital one, fed his ego endlessly. A tap here, a heart there, a comment that lingered too long. It all felt harmless to him. After all, nothing ever came back to bite Rufus. That was his favorite belief. There was humor in his blindness, the tragic kind that only becomes obvious when the damage is already done. Rufus genuinely believed that being confident meant being invincible. He believed love could survive neglect, that loyalty could endure mockery, and that a woman who had endured silence would never dare choose absence. He did not fear loss because he did not believe it applied to him. And so, smiling comfortably in his own reflection, Rufus lived like a man untouched by consequence, unaware that arrogance, when left unchecked, eventually becomes an invitation for disaster. Betty was nothing like Rufus, and perhaps that was why she loved him for so long. Where Rufus was loud, Betty was thoughtful. Where he filled rooms with certainty, she filled spaces with calm. She had a gentle presence that did not beg for attention, yet somehow anchored people without effort. Betty believed love was shown in listening, in consistency, in choosing each other even when no one was watching. She did not love loudly. She loved deeply, patiently, sometimes painfully. And she carried that love with dignity, even when it was not returned in equal measure. Physically, Betty was soft in a way that suggested warmth rather than fragility. Her beauty was not loud or demanding. It unfolded slowly, the way understanding does. She smiled easily, but only when she meant it. And when she was quiet, it wasn't because she had nothing to say, it was because she was choosing her words carefully. Betty believed in marriage with the seriousness of a vow taken once and honored daily. She believed disagreements should be resolved, not weaponized. She believed respect was non-negotiable. Unfortunately, she was married to a man who thought respect was optional once possession was secured. There was a quiet humor in how Betty endured Rufus's arrogance with grace, the way one tolerates noise from a neighboring room, while hoping it eventually fades. She adjusted, softened her expectations, and explained herself gently, too gently. Rufus mistook her emotional intelligence for emotional weakness. What he never understood was that Betty's silence was not emptiness. It was observation. She remembered everything, every dismissal, every smirk, every moment she was made to feel small. And while Rufus believed her love meant permanence, Betty believed love, without respect, was merely patience being abused. From the outside, Rufus and Betty looked like a functional couple, not perfect, but stable enough to fool casual observers. Inside the walls of their marriage, however, imbalance lived comfortably. Rufus dominated conversations the way he dominated decisions. He spoke over Betty without noticing, interrupted her without apology, and dismissed her concerns with practiced ease. Betty learned to phrase her worries gently, as though speaking to a man whose ego bruised easily. She chose peace over confrontation, compromise over conflict, and patience over pride. Rufus accepted all of it without gratitude. Arguments between them followed a familiar rhythm. Betty would express concern. Rufus would laugh, scoff, or accuse her of exaggeration. His confidence turned disagreements into performances, where he always played the winning role. He believed being louder meant being right. Betty often walked away from arguments not because she agreed, but because she was tired of explaining herself to someone committed to misunderstanding her. Rufus never noticed the emotional distance growing because he mistook her withdrawal for obedience. To him, silence meant victory. There was something almost poetic in how imbalance slowly reshaped their home. Betty became smaller in conversation, but sharper in awareness. Rufus became louder in confidence, but weaker in accountability. He never asked himself why Betty stopped sharing certain thoughts. He never wondered why her smiles faded quicker. He simply enjoyed the comfort of control. And like many men who confuse dominance for strength, Rufus never realized the danger of a woman who stops arguing, not because she has lost, but because she has decided. The question came one evening, calmly delivered, without accusation or raised voice. Betty stood beside Rufus, her phone in hand, her tone measured. She asked why he was constantly liking pictures of young women online. Women he didn't know, women who posed provocatively, women whose images lingered longer than they should. Rufus laughed immediately, not amused, but dismissive. He rolled his eyes, scoffing as though Betty had just asked the most ridiculous question imaginable. "It's just pictures," he said, confidence dripping from every word. "You're overreacting." What followed was not just an argument, but a performance of arrogance. Rufus accused Betty of insecurity, jealousy, and paranoia. He spoke louder, faster, sharper. Betty tried to explain that it wasn't about pictures, it was about respect, about boundaries, about how his actions made her feel. Rufus waved it all away with a smirk. "Nothing will ever happen to me," he said proudly. "And you're not going anywhere." The words landed heavier than he intended, though he never noticed. There was a tragic humor in that moment, the way Rufus felt victorious, while unknowingly planting the seed of his downfall. Betty did not scream. She did not cry. She simply looked at him, absorbing the message beneath his words. Her feelings did not matter. Her discomfort was amusing. Her presence was guaranteed. Rufus believed he had ended the discussion. Betty knew he had begun something irreversible. After that night, Rufus became bolder, as if proving a point only he cared about. He liked pictures openly, sometimes while sitting beside Betty, his thumb moving carelessly as though daring her to speak. When she did, gently, he laughed harder. "You're imagining things," he told her. "You're too sensitive." He framed disrespect as confidence and cruelty as honesty. And because Betty still loved him, she questioned herself more than she questioned him. The arguments grew more dramatic. Voices were raised. Doors were slammed. Rufus mocked Betty's emotions, turning her pain into a joke. He reminded her, often, that no woman ever left a man like him. His arrogance was suffocating, but it was also deliberate. He enjoyed the power imbalance, the certainty that he held control. Betty, however, was changing quietly. She stopped explaining herself repeatedly. She stopped begging to be understood. She began watching. There was something poetic in how Betty's silence evolved, not empty, but strategic. While Rufus congratulated himself on winning arguments, Betty was collecting clarity. She realized that the pictures were not the real problem. The problem was a man who believed love meant entitlement, who thought loyalty was guaranteed, and who mistook patience for permanence. And somewhere between humiliation and loneliness, Betty made a decision, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly. She would not fight for respect anymore. She would choose it. Rufus mistook Betty's silence for defeat, and that miscalculation became his favorite comfort. He woke each morning believing the storm had passed simply because the thunder had stopped. Betty no longer argued when he liked pictures openly. She no longer questioned his late nights or his growing attachment to his phone. She no longer demanded explanations. To Rufus, this felt like victory. He strutted through the house with renewed confidence, convinced he had finally trained the marriage into submission. He hummed while scrolling, chuckled at messages, and spoke to Betty with the casual indifference of a man who believed he was irreplaceable. What Rufus didn't understand was that silence, when chosen deliberately, is never empty. It is observation sharpening its blade. Betty, on the other hand, was listening more than she ever had before. She listened not just to Rufus's words, but to his tone, his pauses, his dismissals. She listened to what he said, and, more importantly, to what he no longer bothered to hide. Each careless laugh felt heavier than the arguments before it. Each dismissive shrug carved something permanent into her resolve. There was pain, yes, but there was also clarity. Betty began to see her marriage without the soft filter of hope. She realized she had been carrying the emotional weight alone, protecting a union Rufus no longer respected. And with that realization came a quiet strength, the kind that does not announce itself, but prepares carefully. There was a strange, almost ironic humor in how Rufus congratulated himself during this phase. He bragged casually, not loudly, but confidently, about how peaceful his home had become. He believed Betty had finally accepted her place. He did not notice how she stopped asking for his attention. He did not notice how her eyes no longer followed him when he moved across the room. He certainly did not notice that while he was busy enjoying the comfort of being untouchable, Betty was mentally stepping out of a life she no longer recognized as hers. Loneliness inside marriage is a peculiar kind of pain, one that doesn't scream, but settles quietly in the chest like unfinished sentences. Betty felt it most in moments that should have been ordinary. Sitting beside Rufus while he scrolled endlessly, calling his name and receiving distracted responses. Sleeping next to a man who felt emotionally miles away. Rufus was physically present, but emotionally absent, and that absence grew heavier each day. He laughed more at his phone than he did with her. He guarded his screen like it contained secrets worth protecting more than his marriage. And when Betty noticed, Rufus accused her of looking for problems. The loneliness changed Betty. It didn't make her bitter at first. It made her introspective. She began questioning how she had slowly shrunk herself to fit into Rufus's ego. How often she had apologized just to keep peace. How frequently she had chosen understanding while Rufus chose indifference. Rufus didn't notice the shift because he wasn't looking. He was too busy feeding his pride, too convinced that Betty's love was permanent, guaranteed, and unconditional. He never considered that loneliness, when prolonged, becomes a doorway. There was a tragic irony in Rufus's arrogance during this chapter of their lives. He believed Betty's quietness meant loyalty. He believed her endurance meant devotion. He never imagined that neglect could be more dangerous than anger. And while he basked in the comfort of being wanted by strangers online, Betty stood alone inside her own marriage, slowly learning that companionship does not require shouting. It requires presence. Jonah entered Betty's life quietly, without drama or intention. He was not introduced as temptation, but as conversation. A familiar face, a gentle voice. Someone who noticed when Betty spoke and didn't interrupt her halfway. Jonah didn't speak over her. He didn't mock her concerns. He listened with attention that felt foreign after years of emotional neglect. Their conversations were simple at first, light, respectful, careful. Betty didn't plan to connect with him. She simply felt seen in a way she hadn't in a long time. What made Jonah different wasn't charm or grand gestures, it was restraint. He didn't push. He didn't flirt recklessly. He didn't fill the silence with arrogance. He listened. And listening, Betty realized, was something Rufus had stopped doing long ago. The emotional connection formed slowly, like trust does when it's earned rather than demanded. Betty found herself speaking freely again, laughing softly, remembering who she was before she began editing herself to suit Rufus's ego. There was something almost poetic in how Rufus, unknowingly, pushed Betty toward emotional refuge elsewhere. While Rufus mocked her feelings and dismissed her boundaries, Jonah respected them without being asked. While Rufus demanded admiration, Jonah offered understanding. And while Rufus believed he was untouchable, Betty was quietly learning that affection without respect was no longer enough to sustain her heart. The argument that followed was loud, sharp, and unforgiving. Rufus came home irritated, already defensive, already prepared to dominate the conversation. Betty confronted him, not angrily, but firmly, about his behavior, his absence, his refusal to listen. Rufus snapped. His voice rose, his words cut deep, and his arrogance spilled freely. In the heat of that moment, he said what he had always believed, but never voiced so plainly. "You are replaceable." The sentence landed like glass shattering on marble, sharp, final, irreversible. Betty felt something break inside her that night, but it wasn't her spirit, it was her attachment. She realized that Rufus no longer saw her as a partner, but as a fixture he could discard emotionally while keeping physically. Rufus stormed out, slamming doors, convinced he had once again asserted dominance. He believed Betty would cry herself into submission. Instead, she sat quietly, absorbing the truth he had finally revealed. There was bitter humor in Rufus's confidence as he walked away that night. He truly believed nothing had changed. He believed he had won. He never realized that with one careless sentence, he had freed Betty emotionally. And once a woman detaches internally, the rest is only logistics. From that night forward, Betty stopped hoping Rufus would change. Hope, she realized, had been her heaviest burden. She no longer waited for apologies. She no longer expected accountability. She began planning, not out of revenge, but out of self-preservation. Her conversations with Jonah deepened emotionally, carefully, respectfully. This was not betrayal in her mind, it was survival. Rufus had abandoned the marriage long before she sought comfort elsewhere. Rufus, meanwhile, walked with the swagger of a man convinced he had everything under control. He laughed louder, stayed out longer, and grew more careless. He believed Betty's silence meant surrender. He did not notice her emotional distance because he never bothered to look closely. His arrogance had become routine, and routine breeds blindness. Betty's decision was quiet, but absolute. She would leave, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. Rufus believed nothing could ever happen to him. Betty knew better now. And while Rufus celebrated his imagined victory, Betty was preparing an exit that would leave him screaming into an emptiness he never thought possible. Betty didn't wake up one morning and become a different woman. She simply got tired of being the same woman in a story that kept humiliating her. The decision to leave didn't come with thunder. It came with a kind of quiet clarity, like the moment you finally admit to yourself that the food has spoiled and you've only been swallowing it out of habit. She moved through the house with steady hands and a steady face, even when her chest felt heavy. She stopped folding Rufus's clothes with love, stopped arranging his side of the room like a shrine to a man who had treated her like an optional subscription. She began to sort things into piles, keep, give out, throw away, like she was sorting her own heart. Some things surprised her. She found old receipts of gifts Rufus once brought when he still feared losing her, and she laughed a dry, almost amused sound, because what was romance if it could expire the moment a man got comfortable? Even the walls looked different to her now, less like home, more like a stage where she had played patient wife for too long. And Rufus, in his arrogance, was nowhere to be found emotionally, though he was physically alive somewhere, scrolling and smirking, convinced the world was his. The sale didn't happen with drama. It happened with calm precision. Betty didn't announce it. She didn't threaten Rufus with it during fights like some people did in movies. She did it the way a woman does something when she knows she will not be talked out of it, quietly, carefully, and completely. She asked the right questions, read the right papers, and refused to be rushed. She met with the right people, not because she wanted revenge, but because she wanted freedom that could not be argued with. Every signature she placed felt like a stitch closing a wound Rufus kept reopening. She didn't do it with shaking hands. She did it with the calm of a person who has finally chosen herself. At night, she would sit on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, staring at Rufus's last rude messages like they were museum exhibits of disrespect. "You're too sensitive. It's just pictures. You're not going anywhere." Each one helped her stay firm. Jonah didn't push her. He didn't clap and shout, "Yes, Queen." He simply stayed steady, the way a safe person stays steady, checking in, listening, reminding her she wasn't crazy for wanting peace. And Betty, for once, allowed herself to believe that being loved should not feel like begging. There was a little humor in how invisible Betty had become to Rufus, even while she was dismantling the life he thought he owned. Rufus still walked around with the swagger of a man who believed his wife was furniture, present, useful, and incapable of movement. He was too proud to notice the shifts, the way Betty stopped asking where he went, stopped reacting to his attitude, stopped caring when he withheld affection like a punishment. He didn't notice she had stopped fighting, because fighting implied hope, and Betty had quietly buried hope with dignity. He didn't notice the house slowly emptying of her fingerprints, her favorite mug missing, her scarf no longer on the chair, the family photos taken down like they were no longer telling the truth. If Rufus had been paying attention, he might have felt the air changing. But Rufus didn't believe in warning signs. He believed in his own invincibility. And somewhere between his pride and his carelessness, Betty sold the house that held his ego, without raising her voice once. Rufus came back like a conqueror. Not quietly, not cautiously, like a man arriving to claim a prize. He had Celine beside him, dressed boldly, smiling like she was stepping into a life she had won. Rufus's mood was high, almost playful, the kind of mood a man has when he believes he is about to witness the final defeat of someone he has underestimated. He expected Betty to be inside, maybe sulking, maybe crying, maybe waiting with one last speech. In his mind, Betty's world revolved around him. Even her anger was proof he mattered. He parked with confidence. He walked to the door with the lazy assurance of a man who believed the universe had no power to embarrass him. Celine clung to his arm, whispering something teasing about how wives always calm down. Rufus laughed, that arrogant laugh that always sounded like a door being slammed in someone's face. He reached for his key, already rehearsing the kind of speech he would give if Betty tried to act brave. Something like, "You see? You can't do without me." Something like, "Don't embarrass yourself." The key didn't turn. Rufus frowned and tried again, harder this time, twisting like the lock was the stubborn one. Celine's smile faltered. Rufus leaned in, inspected it, and felt irritation rise because inconvenience was something he didn't tolerate. He tried again, nothing. He knocked once, then twice, then more aggressively, because men like Rufus don't knock with humility. They knock like they are accusing the door of disrespect. Still nothing. He stepped back and looked properly, and that was when he saw it. The lock was different. Not damaged, replaced. Clean, new, unapologetic. Rufus's throat tightened in confusion that quickly turned into anger. "This is my house," he muttered, louder than necessary, as if the air itself needed reminding. Celine tried to make a joke, something silly about maybe she changed it to scare you, but Rufus wasn't laughing anymore. He walked to the window, peered inside, and saw emptiness. Not messy emptiness. Intentional emptiness. The curtains gone. The furniture gone. The walls stripped of warmth. It looked like a house that had been professionally wiped of a person. Rufus's chest thumped once, hard, like his body was warning him. This is not a prank. Then the truth arrived like a slap, through a neighbor's voice. A woman Rufus had greeted before, now standing at a distance, watching with the cautious curiosity people reserve for public disgrace. "Ah, Rufus. You didn't know?" she asked, not unkindly, but with the slow tone of someone describing something already concluded. Rufus turned sharply. "Know what?" he snapped. The woman hesitated, as if choosing words carefully, then said it anyway. "Madam, Betty sold this house. People came. They moved things. New owner even came to check it." Rufus froze. Celine's hand tightened on his arm, not in affection now, but in fear. Rufus's mouth opened and closed, like the sentence refused to form because it would make him look powerless. "That's a lie," he said finally, voice loud, desperate, offended. "She can't. She won't. She wouldn't." But the house stood there, silent, empty, and indifferent, like proof that reality doesn't care about a man's pride. Rufus's pride didn't break neatly. It shattered loudly. First he shouted Betty's name into the air like she was hiding behind the gate laughing. "Betty," he roared, voice cracking at the edges. He knocked again, not with hope, but with rage, pounding the door with the heel of his palm until his skin reddened. Celine stepped back, startled, her eyes darting around as if searching for an exit from embarrassment gathering like a crowd. Rufus paced, breathing fast, muttering insults about Betty, about women, about ingratitude. Anything to avoid admitting the one thing he feared most. He had been outplayed. He tried calling Betty. It went through once, and then stopped. He called again and again until the ringtone felt like mockery. "Pick up," he screamed into the phone, as if volume could force obedience. A small group of neighbors had gathered by then, not close enough to intervene, but close enough to witness. That was the worst kind of punishment for a proud man. Eyes. Witnesses. Silent spectators watching his untouchable image collapse on the same doorstep he thought he owned. Celine moved toward him carefully, the way you approach a dog that has suddenly remembered it can bite. "Rufus, calm down," she whispered, rubbing his arm, trying to soften him with touch. "Maybe it's a misunderstanding. Maybe she's just—" Rufus spun on her, eyes wild. "Misunderstanding," he barked. "Are you seeing this? This is my house." His voice shook, and that shake frightened him more than the locked door, because Rufus didn't do fear. Rufus did control. Celine tried again, forcing a smile that looked pasted on. "We can sort it out. Let's call someone. Let's not make a scene." But the scene had already been made, by his arrogance, by his careless confidence, by the way he had brought a mistress like a trophy to the doorstep of a woman he thought would never dare him. Now even Celine could feel it. The air didn't support Rufus anymore. It stood against him. And the more she tried to console him, the more he looked like a man being comforted after defeat, not celebrated after victory. When Rufus finally got the number of someone connected to the transaction, through frantic calls and shaky demands, he listened with widening eyes as the facts stacked up against him like stones. Yes, the house had been sold. Yes, the documents were complete. Yes, the new owner had rights. No, there was no reversing it by shouting. Rufus's knees nearly buckled, and he caught himself against the gate, breathing like the air had suddenly become too small. Then he screamed again, this time not in anger, but in panic, the kind that rises when a man realizes his power was mostly imagination. He ranted about disrespect, betrayal, humiliation. He cursed Betty's name like it was a spell. Celine hugged him tighter, whispering, it's okay, though her voice trembled, because she knew it was not okay. Rufus wasn't just angry, he was unraveling. And the cruel irony was that the louder he screamed, the clearer it became to everyone watching. This was a man who thought nothing could happen to him. Until it did. The envelope appeared the way consequences often do, quietly, neatly, without drama. It wasn't handed to him with fanfare. It was tucked where a person who knew Rufus well would leave it, in a place his eyes would land once panic settled into desperate searching. A neighbor, perhaps feeling a little pity, mentioned it almost as an afterthought. She left something. I think inside that brown file she dropped with the caretaker. Rufus snatched it like it was a weapon he could use to fight back. His hands shook as he tore it open, expecting insults, expecting threats, expecting the kind of anger he could argue with. What he found instead was worse. Betty's calm. Betty's clarity. Betty's words arranged like mirrors. She didn't start with Jonah. She didn't start with the house. She started with the first time she told him, softly, that his habit of liking girls' pictures online made her uncomfortable. And how he laughed. She wrote it plainly, date by date, moment by moment, not exaggerating, not begging. She described how he called her insecure, how he dismissed her feelings, how he used jokes like knives, smiling while cutting. She described the loneliness that grew inside their marriage, the nights he came home and treated her like background noise, the mornings he protected his phone like it was more precious than her dignity. She wrote about the word replaceable and how it landed in her chest like a final stamp of truth. She didn't write like a bitter woman. She wrote like a woman documenting a crime scene where the victim had finally walked out alive. Rufus's face tightened as he read, his pride trying to fight the sting of accountability. He wanted to call her a liar. He wanted to find one sentence he could twist into overreaction. But Betty's writing left him no rope. It was too clear, too consistent. And then came the part that set his teeth on edge. She admitted Jonah existed, but she didn't romanticize it. She didn't describe wild passion or reckless cheating. She described it like a consequence, not a fantasy. She wrote that Jonah listened when Rufus mocked. That Jonah respected what Rufus dismissed. That she didn't wake up planning to love someone else. She simply woke up tired of being emotionally abandoned in a marriage and told to smile about it. I did not meet Jonah because I wanted to punish you, she wrote, calm as morning light. I met Jonah because you kept pushing me away and then laughing when I stumbled. Rufus's throat burned. That sentence hurt because it sounded like truth. And truth is the one thing pride cannot beat in a fight. By the time Rufus reached the final page, his anger had changed shape. It wasn't just rage anymore, it was humiliation. Betty had not left like a desperate woman. She had left like a woman who had studied him and decided she was done. She ended the letter without begging, without pleading, without giving him the satisfaction of tears. She wrote almost gently that he was free to keep Celine, free to keep liking pictures, free to keep believing he was untouchable, because she would no longer be the woman absorbing the impact of his arrogance. Rufus reread the last lines twice, lips parting, eyes narrowing, because for the first time he realized the worst thing Betty had done wasn't selling the house. It was refusing to remain accessible to his ego. Rufus didn't sleep that night, not because he missed Betty with love, but because his pride wouldn't let the story end with him powerless. He paced wherever he could stay, restless, eyes bloodshot, jaw clenched so tight it ached. Celine lay nearby, pretending to sleep, but her breathing gave her away. Rufus's mind replayed the scene at the house over and over. The key not turning, the empty rooms, the neighbors watching, his own voice cracking as he screamed. Each replay felt like a slap, and the more it stung, the more his arrogance demanded repayment. In Rufus's world, a woman leaving quietly wasn't just heartbreak, it was disrespect. It meant she had acted outside his permission. It meant she had embarrassed him. It meant she had proven he was not untouchable. That was the one truth Rufus couldn't swallow. So in the early hours, with bitterness thick in his chest, Rufus made a vow out loud, like a man swearing an oath to the universe. I will find her. And I will find the man behind this. Celine stirred and sat up, rubbing her eyes, voice soft. Rufus, please calm down. Let's think. Rufus cut her off with a glare. Think, he snapped. I have been thinking. While she was planning, I was busy believing I was safe. His voice shook on the last word, and he hated that it did. Celine moved closer, touching his shoulder. Maybe give it time. Maybe she'll cool down. Rufus laughed, sharp, humorless. Cool down? Betty didn't leave in anger. She left in certainty. The fact that he understood this made him even angrier. Because certainty is not something you can negotiate with. Celine tried to comfort him anyway, murmuring that everything would be okay, that they could start fresh somewhere else, that a house is just a house. Rufus turned toward her slowly and said, with cold intensity, it's not the house. It's what she did to me. Celine swallowed. In that moment, she realized she wasn't holding a victorious man. She was holding a wounded ego with teeth. By morning, Rufus was no longer just panicking. He was plotting. Not business plotting, not money plotting, social and personal plotting. He began calling people who used to smile at him, fishing for information, testing loyalties. Some answered. Some didn't. Some spoke cautiously, like they were afraid of being dragged into his mess. Rufus's pride interpreted every hesitation as betrayal, and betrayal fuels obsession. He promised himself he would confront Jonah face to face, not to reclaim Betty with love, but to reclaim dominance. He imagined dramatic scenes, shouting, threats, humiliation, because Rufus's mind had always been addicted to control. But somewhere under that obsession, a smaller truth kept whispering. Betty didn't just leave. Betty chose someone who listened. And that meant Rufus's enemy wasn't Jonah alone. His enemy was the version of himself Betty had finally refused to endure. Rufus hated that truth more than he hated the locked door, because the locked door could be blamed on Betty. But that truth belonged to him. Rufus woke each morning no longer feeling untouchable, but hunted by the idea that Betty had escaped his reach without asking permission. His arrogance didn't disappear, it mutated. It became obsession, sharp and restless, the kind that doesn't let a man sit still. He replayed memories compulsively, searching for the exact moment he lost control of the narrative. He convinced himself Betty had not left because she was strong, but because she had been influenced. That was easier to swallow than admitting his behavior had driven her away. Jonah became the symbol Rufus fixated on, the proof he needed to believe this. Wasn't his fault. In Rufus's mind, if he could confront Jonah, everything would realign. His pride demanded a face-to-face reckoning. Celine watched this transformation with growing unease. The man who once strutted confidently now paced endlessly, muttering plans and grievances under his breath. His voice carried a bitterness she hadn't anticipated, a need for validation that drained the room. He no longer spoke of them or a future together. Everything revolved around Betty. Celine tried to soothe him, reminding him that they were together now, that he had won. Rufus snapped at that word. Won what? He had a woman beside him, yet his mind chased the one who had walked away. Celine began to realize she hadn't replaced Betty. She had inherited her chaos. What Rufus didn't understand was that obsession is louder than arrogance, but far less attractive. The more he talked about finding Betty, confronting Jonah, proving himself, the smaller he sounded. His pride had once been confident, now it was desperate. And desperation, unlike arrogance, has a smell people can sense from far away. Rufus found them where he least expected peace to exist. Betty and Jonah, standing together, unhurried, unbothered, as if life had not been violently rearranged behind them. The sight struck Rufus like insult layered upon insult. Betty looked calm. Not triumphant, not defensive, just calm. Jonah stood close, not possessively, but protectively, the way a man does when he knows he doesn't need to prove anything. Rufus didn't announce himself with grace. He stormed forward, voice already raised, rage guiding his steps. People turned. Eyes followed. Rufus didn't care. In his mind, this was the moment everything would snap back into place. His accusations came fast and loud. Betrayal, manipulation, disrespect. He pointed at Jonah like he had caught him committing a crime. Betty didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. That unnerved Rufus more than shouting would have. When she finally spoke, it wasn't to defend Jonah. It was to clarify the truth Rufus had spent months running from. She told him plainly that Jonah had not stolen her. Rufus had pushed her away, inch by inch, laugh by laugh, dismissal by dismissal. Jonah didn't arrive as temptation. He arrived as understanding. And understanding, she said, had been absent in her marriage long before Jonah existed. The crowd felt the shift. Rufus's anger looked excessive beside Betty's composure. His words tangled, repeating themselves, losing force. Betty's calm landed harder than any insult. Jonah didn't interrupt, didn't posture, didn't challenge Rufus physically. He didn't need to. Rufus walked away from that confrontation with what he feared most, not defeat by another man, but exposure of himself. Celine had not imagined it would end this way, not with screaming doors or dramatic accusations, but with a slow, suffocating realization that she had attached herself to a man unraveling. She watched Rufus pace the room endlessly, replaying the same story over and over, each retelling sharpening his bitterness rather than easing it. His words were no longer about love lost, but about pride wounded. Betty's name came up constantly, not with longing, but with rage that she no longer responded to him. Celine noticed how Rufus never asked how Betty was doing, only how she dared to leave. And in that distinction, Celine felt a cold truth settle into her chest. This man was not grieving a marriage. He was grieving control. The confidence she once found attractive now looked brittle, loud and desperate, like a crown slipping off a head that refused to bow. At night, Celine lay awake listening to Rufus mutter in his sleep, rehearsing arguments Betty would never hear again. When she tried to speak about their future, Rufus waved her away, impatiently, eyes distant, mind still trapped in humiliation. He didn't hold her the way he once did. He didn't even look at her with gratitude. Celine realized she had not been chosen. She had been used as proof, as rebellion, as ego fuel. And now that the rebellion had failed, she was excess baggage. The irony stung sharply. The same arrogance Rufus used to dismiss his wife was now being turned on her. The same emotional neglect Betty had endured was being handed to Celine, wrapped in irritation instead of charm. Celine packed quietly, not out of fear, but out of clarity. She understood now that Rufus was not a man who loved deeply. He was a man who needed to be admired endlessly. And when admiration dried up, he turned cruel, obsessive, and small. She left a short note, nothing poetic, nothing dramatic. Just absence. Rufus noticed hours later, standing alone in a room that suddenly felt too big. For the first time, he experienced abandonment without explanation. The same emptiness he had inflicted on Betty for months. And Celine, walking away without looking back, felt something she hadn't expected at all. Relief. Rufus had always feared silence, but he never understood why until it finally settled around him without resistance. There was no one left to argue with, no one to impress, no one to dominate into submission. The house he temporarily stayed in felt borrowed, impersonal, like a reminder that nothing in his life truly belonged to him anymore. He sat for long stretches doing nothing, replaying memories he had once brushed aside as unimportant. Betty standing calmly while he laughed. Betty asking questions he refused to answer. Betty going quiet while he grew louder. Each moment returned sharper now, stripped of the arrogance that once protected him from self-reflection. Rufus realized slowly and painfully that the woman he called too sensitive had simply been more emotionally awake than he ever was. He tried to rewrite the story in his head, the way proud men often do when reality becomes unbearable. He told himself Betty overreacted, that Jonah took advantage of a vulnerable woman, that Celine was a distraction that went wrong. But every version collapsed under the same weight, accountability. Rufus could no longer deny that his behavior had created the very outcome he despised. He had treated love like a guarantee, respect like a favor, and loyalty like a leash. And when Betty finally slipped free, he was left holding nothing but his pride, which suddenly felt heavy, useless, and embarrassingly fragile. The realization didn't come with redemption. It came with regret, the kind that doesn't seek forgiveness because it knows it's too late. Rufus understood now that power without empathy is hollow, and confidence without humility is just noise. He saw clearly that his downfall wasn't orchestrated by Betty or Jonah or Celine. It was authored by his own arrogance. And for the first time in his life, Rufus faced a truth he could not shout away. Some losses do not return, not because you didn't chase hard enough, but because you failed when it mattered most. Betty's life did not become perfect after she left, but it became honest, and that difference changed everything. Her days were quieter now, not because she had lost something, but because she had removed constant tension from her existence. She woke without dread. She spoke without rehearsing. She laughed without wondering if it would be mocked later. There were moments of sadness. Yes, memories don't vanish simply because you choose yourself, but those moments no longer controlled her. They passed like clouds instead of storms. Jonah never rushed her healing. He didn't treat her pain like something to fix or exploit. He treated it with respect, which, to Betty, felt like a language she had waited too long to hear. What surprised Betty most was how little she needed to look back. She didn't feel the urge to prove anything to Rufus. She didn't crave revenge or validation. She didn't even hate him the way people expect women to hate men who hurt them. She simply understood him now, and understanding released her. She saw Rufus clearly as a man who confused dominance with love and silence with obedience. And she saw herself clearly too, a woman who had loved deeply, endured patiently, and finally chosen wisely. That clarity gave her peace no argument ever could. Rufus became a lesson Betty carried lightly, not a wound she dragged forward. She had learned that love should never require shrinking, that respect should not have to be negotiated, and that silence can be a strategy, not a weakness. And somewhere in the quiet rhythm of her new life, Betty smiled, not because she had won, but because she had survived herself long enough to choose better. Rufus had once believed nothing could ever happen to him. Betty proved something far more powerful. When a woman stops begging for respect, everything happens exactly as it should.